pesquisa sociológica, às vezes, confirma teorias, seja a respeito de como nos organizamos na família, no lazer e no trabalho, como ocupamos o território ou como nos movimentamos em escala planetária. Mas as ciências sociais também podem questionar verdades aparentes e inverter a lógica do senso comum. Surgem então constatações como a de que o global não abre mão do nacional. Pelo contrário, os países contribuem individualmente para compor as engrenagens do mundo contemporâneo, comumente visto como entidades sem pátrias nem fronteiras. Da mesma forma, cai por terra a ideia de que cidades globais são concorrentes. Elas seriam, na verdade, complementares, já que foram trajetórias diferentes que levaram cada metrópole à internacionalização. Conceitos como esses são produto do trabalho de Saskia Sassen, nascida na Holanda, criada na Argentina e radicada nos Estados Unidos, onde é professora da Universidade de Colômbia. Crítica das altas finanças, que, segundo ela, ganham mesmo quando todos os demais saem perdendo, e entusiasta da contribuição que a biologia pode dar ao gerenciamento urbano, Saskia Sassen esteve no Rio de Janeiro, onde conversou com o Milênio.
The global transcends the framing of the national states, but partially emerges and operates within that national framing. This is very interesting. It's something you have found in your research and using your words. Much of the global is still dressed in the clothes of the national. Can you give examples?
Well, I mean, there are many examples. They're all a bit elusive. But let's say when global finance rises, becomes powerful, it needs a couple of things, just two little things, from all national governments that are part of, the global economic system. So that is not necessarily North Korea. They didn't bother with North Korea. And what they wanted, one of the things that they wanted was, at all costs, control inflation, even if it means that you are losing jobs. Now that little thingy, which was in fact implemented, and it's implemented through national governments, it becomes a national policy, but it actually was coming from global finance. That little change represented a 180-degree change in what had been the policy in all democracies around the world, all electoral systems, which is you privilege job growth, even if it produces inflation. So finance just needed that one little change, major change, but it had to go through the nationals. That for me is an example. In doing that, they actually enabled the growth of global finance. That for me is the global getting made deep inside the national, and in this case also a global intervention that looks like national policy. So that is one of the things that I mean. I mean, that is maybe one of the most elusive ones. But my main argument is really that, to a very large extent, the global is made inside of the national. Another good example here on this subject of how the global gets constituted in the national is the fact that, on the one hand, there is no such entity as a global firm. You know that there is no such legal persona. The European Union has been trying to develop the legal persona of a global firm, of a European firm, for decades. It has not worked. At the same time, we know that there are about 400,000 plus firms that conduct themselves as if they were global. How do you close the gap between those two facts? There is no such thing as all firms are national, at best they're binational. And so what has happened is that government after government after government has changed a bit of this law, a bit of that, produced guarantees of contract, protection of property rights, so that in each of these different countries you have an operational space for firms that gives them guarantees of contract and protection of property. And that allows them to conduct themselves as if they were global. Now that space happens deep inside the national. When you stand back and look at it globally, say, there's a fairly homogeneous set of protections, but made to enormously different instruments. So national governments and the population of a country can keep on thinking that the national is the national because the global is homogeneous, standardized, but actually they have used the particular instruments, so these are sort of to me very interesting. And I feel like I go discovering, I go digging to sort of find out some of these things.
It's interesting, you wrote an article, or it was an interview, you mentioned the World Bank and International Monetary Fund as bridging entities, but as foot soldiers. So are they
right?
They are not that important anymore?
Well, no, they're not that important anymore. They have done the big job. Now there is cleanup work. The IMF has re-entered the scene, cleaning up. It is aiding and enabling the austerity implementations in, say, in the European Union. The IMF is pretty poor. I always think of the IMF as something that has had many incarnations. So, when the 80s arrive, this global era begins, and you needed to standardize standards, because that is what the global does require. Standards of everything, where you're manufacturing plugs. If you're going to outsource, you have to standardize the way you're going to make plugs. The problem with the Dreamliner is they outsourced too much. When the Dreamliner is the airplane, right? When all the pieces came back together, they couldn't put it together. They outsourced just a bit. They went on the other side of the curve. But the point here is that the IMF, the WTO, played crucial roles in changing the standards. You see, the standards for what does it mean to run a good economy, or to be good at running an economy. So you need certain standards. You have to control inflation, above all. It helped that project of global finance in that sense. You have to have free trade. You have to open up your borders. You have to protect foreign firms if they want to. You have to enable them. That was an extraordinarily important job. By the 2000s, they were done, and they were poor. They had to close offices. They couldn't pay the rent. They had to fire economists. When Argentina has its crises, they beg Argentina, take our loan. Because they survive on making loans.
Sure.
And people don't realize how poor the IMF was and how many offices it closed and how many economists it fired. They think the IMF is. No. The IMF is many things, and it sort of adapts. It's a mutant. And Argentina said, no, we know that story. And this was really bad for the IMF because it was losing purpose. So when the austerity issues begin in 2007, suddenly the IMF is back in the picture. It's very poor. It does not have a lot of money. It has to work with government. It always has. But anyhow, so now it fulfills this austerity implementation. And austerity, of course, is getting a lot of criticism. We're not sure that austerity works. I'm not sure at all that it works. But anyhow, but that is what it. So it is this changing role that it has.
So another aspect of this massive executive power, or too much power in the executive branch, that's very clear in the case of the U.S.
Not in Brazil?
Well, no, because I'm going to talk about the drones. I mean, you
yes,
wrote
yes,
about
yes.
the drone policy.
Right. Yes.
And according to you, it shows that the liberal state no longer works. That's something you've written. It's true that along with the drone policy, you've got in the U.S. this massive surveillance system.
Yes.
So do you think both are distortions of the liberal state and consequences of this excess of power in the executive branch?
Yes, I think so. The logic of the system is very particular. It's not that they are targeting. It's everything. You're gathering data. If there is your average Joe Blow that they're not analyzing the data. They just want to have it. So if an incident happens and you can connect that with somebody else, Then you go check in. You go check out the one that you didn't know. You know about one person, somebody you suspect, and then you go and check out the person that somehow also appears on the radar screen. And then all that data is refused. Now, the criticism that I do, that I make, is that, is there something wrong with this? First, all of us in the territory of the United States, according to this logic, we're all suspect.
Mm-hmm.
We're not condemned, we are not found guilty, we're just suspect. That is a necessary step, in a way, for that system to work. So my question is, do we need that enormous superstructure of technical and personnel up to 1 million top secret clearance? Top secret clearance is very rare. It is not your... do we need that much in order to get at what the real aim is? Those 3, 5, 2, 7, who knows, individuals who at one point or another might be considering doing a terrorist act. There's something about that logic, and in that sense I say this is a faulty algorithm. Finance needs algorithms to do what it does, and every now and then it gets one wrong, right? And then we have a little bit of crisis. And I say, this algorithm for our national security, it's not right. And then I connect that with this excessive, unaccountable power and it's an informal power. It's not the diagram of the liberal state. You wouldn't see that. It is informal, unaccountable power that is deep inside the executive branch. The executive branch includes, the Pentagon, the state, the central bank, etc., etc. So this is sort of my view, that I don't want to throw the liberal state out. I think the liberal state is a far more complex capability.
Exactly, that would be my question. So what comes next?
Right.
And if there is a crisis? And it's interesting, a question that you asked somewhere. Where or when does censoring with an S?
I love it. Take you with me on my trip.
With a C.
You know everything about what I've written. That's right, yes. That is another story, right? This slide shift.
But it's beautiful. I mean, censoring with an S and censoring with a C, they are two different things. But at the same time,
Exactly. That's the slide shift. The same capability can be censoring you in the sense of giving you opportunities to connect, etc., to detect, when there is a methane gas that you cannot smell. Methane gas, I think you smell, but whatever the gas you don't smell, I mean, positive. So there's a little mouse there you may want to get rid of, or a rat in New York City, But at the same time, it is also a mechanism that can survey you. So in that sense, this is this ambiguous zone where we are. But again, I think that a working liberal state, even if it is poor, is a more complex capability than the richest multinational firm, because it has to handle many different logics. A working liberal state is a state that in its interiority is a combat zone between different ways. Should we protect labor? Should we protect finance, etc.? That's an astounding event, and that it can keep on functioning even though there are all these contradictions. Each unit of the liberal state has its own agenda and will fight for its own agenda. And in that sense, no firm has that. It's one logic. One simple logic in a firm. So we've got to protect that complex capability that is the liberal state, but we also need to reorient it towards other. There's a lot to be done.
Yeah, it gets very clear with the policy, the way the U.S. and other countries handle immigration, for instance. And you wrote, these states have been willing to sacrifice major and minor laws, and more generally the spirit of the law, one of the most valued achievements of our collective history in the West. That's quite serious, isn't it?
I know. I think that those are distortions. I mean, they're always going to happen. For me, everything is a curve, So a bit of distortion, but you've got to live with it. This is life. Mm-hmm. The perfect husband or partner you marry at some point shows that it's not that perfect. But when it gets to the other side of the curve, and this is where we have been at, I would say, with immigration in the last probably decade, that we have distorted our own laws, which is truly destructive. in order to persecute people who are basically poor, weaker than whatever the power we are deploying, and all they want is a job to support. There's got to be a better way to do it then.
You wrote about the foreclosures, and it's a little bit scary because
it is a little bit scary.
And you call it expulsion, right? It's more than inequality nowadays. And it's like masses of middle-class workers who no longer can pay their mortgages, and they're camping in tents across the U.S. And is it going to get worse in your opinion?
Well, the end of this cycle, this is a short, brutal history. It really begins in 2001, but very, very mildly. It takes off in 2005. And by 2008, it's over. But the contracts, these mortgages, were often 5-year mortgages. So we know that still these years are still, in 2014, evidently all the contracts will be finished. Then it's over. Now, foreclosures. More than 10 million households homes have been foreclosed. Foreclosure is a notice. It tells you you're in trouble, basically, and you're basically on your way out. What we know of actual homes being where people, we know that it's about 10 million. We have now 13.3 million foreclosure notices, and 10 million are out. Now, most of those people do not necessarily become homeless, okay, they disappear, but what we do have is thousands and thousands of people living in tents, in tent cities, provided by nice municipal governments. And they look just like the little tents of the international humanitarian system. This is not social exclusion, it's not simply unemployment, it's deeper than that. Greece is, of course, the most dramatic example. Sure. Where now the Greek debt has been upgraded a bit, They're doing fine. Well, yes, they're doing fine in a shrunken economic space that has thrown out up to 40% of the people. The people are still there, but they're not part of that economic system. So I argue that to simply speak in some of these situations of more inequality, no. At some point, again, we're on the other side of the curve, and we need another type of word to capture this tragedy. So I think this is an extraordinary event in the United States. But the instrument has traveled globally. In Hungary always was more connected, to the Western financial, even under communism still. And in Hungary there are over 1 million foreclosures that happened in the last 5 years. In Latvia, 360,000. In Spain, over 400,000. So these are just examples. This is a mechanism for readjusting. I mean, one little it winds up being. I'm not saying that it was designed to be that, but all of these little things wind up being mechanisms to readjust the economic space that is seen as the workable space. And so it's the opposite of the post-World War II decades, when the system brought in people as workers and as consumers. It was an economy of mass manufacturing, mass consumption, mass production, mass construction of housing, etc., etc. And now it's the opposite.
It's beautiful when you say that it's possible to delegate back to the biosphere. I mean, this process of having better, overcoming the climate change or, finding solutions. I mean, the cities are a part of the problem. I mean, too many people, too many cars, too much emission, but also part of the solution, right?
Right. Yes, I'm really interested in biology. I think the people who do cities, whether research, building, etc., they have understood that they have to bring in the new technologies, they have to bring in topography, land, climate, etc. Biology is the missing link, I argue. And so just to give you 2 examples of what I mean by this. So some biologists have, and most biologists, by the way, are not interested in the environment, but some are. They're like geeks about the environmental question, and I adore them. And so one finding was that if you put a certain type of bacterium in dirty organic waters, in other words, what we produce in massive amounts in kitchens, bathrooms, restaurants, etc., but organic, it actually produces a molecule of a plastic that is resistant, durable, but biodegradable. In other words, what is now, this is like recoding, right? What is now a negative for cities, they don't know how to dispose it, they dispose it wrong. In the United States, they keep putting it in landfills, then it becomes methane gas, and poof, it explodes. It's terrible, actually. But imagine, this would mean that cities can produce plastic with what is now a negative, all those dirty brown waters. They could literally begin to export dirty waters so that others can make a plastic, or export the plastic. And we need plastic in everything. What we don't need is this plastic that does not biodegrade, because it is truly, we all know, right, that this is a very serious threat to fish, especially to water bodies. So there is another example, which is a bacterium that it's like a paint on concrete sidewalks, roofs, etc. As it lives its little life in concrete, it deposits a calcium that seals off greenhouse emissions and eventually actively purifies the air right around it. In other words, suddenly cities, these massive concentrations of concrete, actually can become, a scale-up phenomenon, purifiers of their own air, right around it, not on a. But this is extraordinary, and so for me, the environmental challenge cannot be left to policymakers, or to architects. We need to work with the biosphere, and my basic argument is that the city and the biosphere have an enormous amount of connections. Right now, they're all negative, but they are there. And can we think of the connections as a capability whose valence we have to change to positive? And so these examples that I just give you, these two adorable bacteriums, that is an example. But that is where I'm sort of obsessing about. Policy, there's far too much policy being made. It's not enough.
Well, the solutions start with good ideas, with people like you, I'm sure. Professor Saskia Sassen, thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure.
It was my pleasure, too.